But now perhaps it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to weigh Alfie when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before. Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy. Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together, they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man, you are indeed. But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony and looking at the tortoise who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller and he could get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver asked. "That's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller, but in tortoise language, of course. Will that work? Of course it'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy. Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, Esio, Trot, take a tib, relams, a tib relams. "That'll do it, Mrs. Silver," he said, handing her the paper. "I don't mind trying it," Mrs. Silver said, "but look here, I wouldn't want it to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy." "He won't, dear lady, he won't," Mr. Hoppy said. "See it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky." "If it works," Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, "then you are the cleverest man alive."